Nanditha, I want to start with you right away because I read this marvelous essay by you on mythology and history and how the two, by disassociating the two, we've done a great disservice to our history. And I thought that was a very profound idea. And you actually showed why it is so.
You see, I took the story of
Yeah.
Firstly, let me thank you, Kaveri, for inviting me, and I'd like to also thank the New Indian Express for inviting me. I write for them once a month, so it's...
So it's like having our own
like
in-house author.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
As what I did was I took up the Ramayana, and I went to many sites. Of course, the well-known ones, Ayodhya and all, will naturally talk about Ram. But having worked with tribes, I went to many of the tribal areas, and there I found that they had a memory of Ram which stops at the point where he came. For example, the Saura tribes, you have them in Orissa too, where he comes to Shabari and she gives him those fruits. And they don't know that he went to Lanka and came back, you know.
But they know there.
They stop. He came and he ate with us. You know, that kind of thing. And there were many other, the Nishadas, they still call their ancestor, the man who took Rama across. So these things are memory. You see, mythology is the ancient man's memory of his past, his universe. So to say everything, yes. I mean, if a monkey flies across the mountain, you have to give that much poetic latitude to Valmiki. After all, he was not a non-fiction writer.
I love what you said, that he had to sell his story.
Yes, he had to sell his story. Who's going to read it if it's a dull newspaper report?
Right.
So he had to sell it. So you will find that there is an iota of truth in everything, because you know, even if you take the best works of fiction, take Shakespeare, he based everything on a true event, on Plutarch's lives and so on. So there is no perfect fiction. What has happened, unfortunately, is that the British made Indian history into myth. And I mean, India's past, they said proto-history, all that is myth. And history begins with Alexander. Now, are you trying to tell me that we started only with the 4th century BC? That's just not possible. And they gave an interpretation of history as they wanted. For example, we are in Kalinga, and let me talk about Kalinga. We have never heard anything about Kalinga before or after Ashoka.
Exactly.
It's as if it didn't exist before.
It drops off the map.
It drops off the map. But what we don't remember is that Ashoka was already a Buddhist when he came here. He warns the people of Kalinga, if you don't do as I tell you, I'll come back and my descendants will come back here. He threatens the tribes, even after those 100,000 people were killed and everything. And he takes back 150,000 slaves. They are deported to Magadha. So he's good and not so good, you know. Let's take things as a fact. And definitely I think there is a kernel of truth in every so-called mythology. You know, I don't like the term mythology, because are you trying to say that Dwarka, where they found the palace, if you read S.R. Rao's writing about how he discovered Dwarka, he went with the Mahabharata in his hand, and he looked at the Mahabharata's descriptions, and he searched for what was mentioned there, and he found that. It happened to be underwater, so we can't go and see it. And we have not been very good historians as Indians, I must say. But there was always history, and it exists. And I'll come to the south later.
Parvati, I wanted to bring up this other fact. For instance, in your new book, you have a wonderful sort of like a duet between Badauni and Amir Khusro. So one praises and the other disses, you know. So you have two sources of Akbar, who was the great. Again, a very interesting dialogue almost, and I love the way you're able to use both the sources. Talk a bit about finding these sources and getting them, you know, to tell you a story. and then creating this wonderful story out of it.
Well, thank you very much, Kaveri, and thank you for having me here, you and the New Indian Express. It's lovely. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Odisha too. I'm very glad to be in this state. I think that was, to me, one of the most enjoyable. You know, there's a sort of embarrassment of riches when it comes to sources on Akbar, who was my last subject, and it's really very fortunate that these sources don't at all agree with each other on anything. I mean, Badauni and Abul Fazl was Akbar's court historian, and Badauni was employed in Akbar's court as his, he worked as a translator for many, working in fact on translations of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And he, the two of them joined on virtually the same week or the same month, joined at the same rank. But Abul Fazl rose to great heights. Badauni remained sort of stuck. Abul Fazl became Akbar's confidant, his friend, his historian, and his great admirer. Eventually paid for that intimacy with Akbar with his life when he was assassinated by Akbar's son Salim. Badauni, on the other hand, became more and more disenchanted with, Akbar's, what he perceived as Akbar's heresies and blasphemies and, unrelenting sort of experimentations with all kinds of ideas, all kinds of faiths. And while Abul Fazl is writing this, this court history of his, which is fabulous. I mean, it's a monumental work of history. It's full of detail, full of course, praise, full of event. Badauni is sitting possibly late at night, secretly scribbling his angry, bitter thoughts about the emperor in his secret diary, which is published after Akbar dies. And to me, and then there are other sources too, amongst them the Jesuits, who are, also not particularly, somewhat more critical again, but in different ways. But these two, being so close and yet so different, allowed me the facility to see Akbar in not just as Akbar's the Great, because right from the time of his own life there have been opinions about him have been contested. So if you were to only read Abul Fazl, if that was the only source that had existed, it might not I might not even have wanted to write about him, because there's only so much that you can take of a man's greatness. But then you have Badauni sort of tempering that, and sort of. I hesitate to call myself a historian, but I write history, and part of the job of writing history is to kind of nudge out little nuggets of truth, or what might have been, because every historical source has its own bias. So in that sense, it was a great. It's a wonderful thing that these two contrasting sources exist, and they allow you to see Akbar not just as either this superhuman hero or this unmitigated villain, but rather as a man, a very, very complicated man with many, many different sort of facets to his personality.
And which brings me to, when we talk about Akbar, you've also written on Jahangir and Babur for children, which brings me to that idea that we actually have, that perhaps the North has been disproportionately represented in our history compared to the South. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I brought this just to tell you. Ishwari, these are textbooks, okay?
Right.
Not later literature. Ishwari Prasad, who is a textbook for BA history. Vedic Age to Rajputs is 115 pages. The Deccan and the Far South, 7 pages.
7 pages.
Then the medieval Islamic period, that is the Sultanate and the Mughals, 190 pages, and medieval South India doesn't exist. No. R.C. Mazumdar, South is 9 pages, the North is 171, then the medieval period in the North is 192. He gives 77 pages to Vijayanagar, and
oh, not bad. Very
he gives 3 pages to Orissa.
Okay.
The only historian who looked at the map and said, oh dear, there's a place called Orissa. And many of them don't bother about the East Bengal. Nobody mentions the Ahom kings, who are the only people who could keep away the Mughals. They were never conquered. I mean, there's so much. For example, in the south, take the Cholas. They are the only people with an enormous navy who conquered with their navy all the land from Sri Lanka all the way to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and they went as far as Vietnam, and they went and colonized as far as Vietnam and Philippines, and they traded up to China. How many people know that the last Hindu king of the Philippines was a Chola king? Wow. And he was forcibly converted and then removed. I mean, these are all things which, to tell you, even many Tamilians don't know. Right. So it's not as if it's not known, but you can see, that's why I brought this. I counted the pages.
Remarkable, yeah, thank you. This is a work of...
because I was shocked when I saw only 7 pages or 9 pages.
I hope people have seen Ponniyin Selvan at least, and some will at least read Kalki if nothing
But that's not history, that's historical fiction.
Story, exactly.
He's taken 2 or 3 characters who lived in that period. But at least he shows the navy.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you. And I wanted to bring in Parvati because she's written Jahangir as historical fiction as well.
As history, not fiction.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring you in here and talk a bit about this, and then we'll go to Nanditha, and then we'll have to close the session, otherwise I'll be thrown off the stage. Yeah.
On the question of North and South.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, as Nanditha said, it is rather, we're talking about North and South, well, when we're sitting in the East, so between the Cholas, say, and the Mughals, in Odisha, somebody may say, well, what about the Gangas? What about the, the Gajapatis? So I certainly, I think it's a complicated question. It's certainly, I think in all histories, some dynasties, some events acquire disproportionate presence. I mean, say the Tudors in England, it sometimes feels as if Netflix would collapse if there was no Tudor dynasty, and they just sort of, the Romanovs of Russia, I mean, of the Russian Empire, they have a larger-than-life personality. The Mughals in India certainly have had a great hold on the popular imagination and the scholarly imagination for a very long time. Partly perhaps because they are just a sort of larger-than-life, fabulous, sort of magnificent dynasty. And partly, again, maybe to go back to what you were saying in the beginning, the British history, British history writing of the colonial period has something to do with this too, because the British arrive at about the beginning of Jahangir's reign is when the East India Company is founded, and the first ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe from King James's court, arrives here. And at that time, England is this impoverished little country of no consequence, seeking desperately trade with this vast, rich, powerful empire. And you can see from Thomas Roe's writing how bitter he is, how hurt his dignity is to have to sort of bow and scrape over here in Hindustan. And it's the same company that then eventually exiles and removes Bahadur Shah Zafar. And the history that is written by the colonial, victorious British Raj is seeking in some ways to counter, to sort of position itself against sort of the Mughals, right? So a lot of the writing is trying to say, well, they were really bad, we are much better. And therefore, there's a lot more research, writing, translation of that time. But having said all of that, I think certainly that India has one of the richest troves of histories in the world. And from my own memory of learning history in school, I think there's a concerted and optimistic attempt to try and bring everyone in. But eventually, what happens, it becomes a kind of listing, because there's only so much you can say. There's only so much space that you can devote to, every region, every space, and which is why partly history turns sometimes into one of the least favorite subjects in schools, because it becomes almost a recitation of names and dates. But in fact, once you actually start getting into it, once you start reading region by region, place by place, it's just fascinating, and there's just so much to learn and to understand and to read and to discover. So I would certainly agree that we should have more more of everything.
Nanditha, last point.
Can I just add a little bit to what she says?
Yeah.
It's likely that the British did not want to write about the South when it came to the British, to colonial history, because the Portuguese were thrown out by Queen Abaka of Ullal in coastal Karnataka. King Marthanda Varma of Travancore defeated the Dutch East India Company, and they left the country. All the early revolts against the British were in the south. The people who defeated him were Queen Mangama of Madurai, Velu Nachiyar of Shivaganga, who had an entire battalion of 4,000 women, whose commander poured oil and ghee over herself, jumped into the British depot and blew it up, and that was, they had to sue for peeps.
Let us not go there.
So I think there was a point in the British not writing about the South, but as a result, I mean, everyone talks about First War of Indian Independence, 1857. My God, there have been so many in the South. So I think our historians, Indian historians, post-independence, have done a great disservice to India, because it's a short period of 200 years, and you could have included everyone in that.
I leave it to both of you to take this, to take that mantle forward. I think we're reading so much from, people like you that we really don't need our historians anymore.
Well, I think Anirudh Kanisetti, Manu Pillai, these people have been doing a lot of work now.
I think they've done wonderful work, and like Nanditha as well. Thank you very much, guys. I'm so sorry I have to cut this short, but I can talk forever. Thank you.